Obviously, as you realize, many of the devices that you make use of need some form of storage to be available to store things on the device. How many of you use iOS devices? iPhone or iPad? Do you have access to a file system on it? Yes. In what way? Oh, not jailbreak. No, I'm not talking about it. No, standard. Your grandmother. Does your grandmother have access to a file system? Oh, I shouldn't say you, because you guys are more advanced than and obviously, Apple frowns upon people jailbreaking into their devices. But with Android, slightly different. With Android, you do have access to a real file system on the device, but you are advised not to touch certain things on the file system. If you are familiar with Linux, you know how to go into Android. You can do something called rooting on Android, and then you can do a lot of damage to your device if you want, if you don't know what you're doing. But basically, in Android, you get access to the raw file system if you require. In iOS, they sort of protect you from that by allowing only application storage inside specific applications. So the application designers have to implement their own handling of storage within their applications. And so, there are pros and cons to each of the approaches, and it's beyond us to discuss which one is right or which one is wrong. Each of them have their own way, and people seem to be happy with either one of those. Specifically with Android, when you think about data storage, why exactly do you need to store data? As you realize, on your devices, when you think about it, you switch on your mobile phones and rarely switch them off, right? They are on for days together. But when you power off your devices, if you don't have data in persistent storage, whatever changes you made to your device will be completely gone. Whether in terms of preferences, choices that you make, settings that you do for your device, or within specific applications, you may have settings that you access and set up. Things like, for example, changing the background color of things, or background screen of something, and things like that. If you don't have a way of storing this information, when you power off and power on the device, all these changes would be lost. Okay? So persistent storage allows you to store persistent data. One more example of persistent data would be, for example, you make use of the calendaring application on your device, and then you store all your events in your calendaring application. Obviously, you want this data to be available even if you power off your device. Similarly, your contacts application stores all your contacts, and that should still be there on your device even after you power off and power on. What kind of memory do you think is being used for storing all these things? What kind of storage is used on your standard computers for persistent data? Standard PCs for persistent data. Where do you store persistent data on your standard computers? The moment you power off your device, everything in the memory will disappear, right? So how do you store it between, reboots of your device? What's the storage medium that you make use of on your PC? Sorry? The hard drive. That's the place where you store the hard drive. Or if you are rich, you can afford to have a solid state drive, but that's basically serving the same purpose. You are putting it on persistent storage, so even if you power off, the data remains there. But for small devices, like mobile phones, where is the persistent storage? In what form do you include it? Any guesses? Flash memory. Flash is the storage of choice for these devices. Flash memory is nothing but solid state storage in a different form, right? So that is where you need to store. all your persistent data. You need to remember where you store all this data. Well, obviously, you do store data there, but you want access to this data. How do you get access to the data between reboots of your device? Now, within the Android framework, Android provides 3 different ways of managing persistent storage based upon why you need it. Okay? Obviously, you can resort to standard file system for taking care of things, but there are more appropriate ways of handling data persistence depending on the need that you need to. So flat file based storage is obviously there in Android, and as I said, the Android device does have a flat file system. If you acquire a suitable storage manager, you can access this flat file system and so on. So this is a standard way. So you can write, if you need to store any persistent data, you can open a file. How do you open a file in Java? Any Java experts here?
Expert.
I have forgotten. Well, it is there in the slides that come later on, how to open files and close files. But basically, when you open a file on the storage, and then you store items in there, and then you can read off the file and so on, and so forth. So this is always there. So this is for storing private data in device memory, for storing public data on external storage. For example, if you add an SD card to your device, you can store data there. And then this uses the standard Java file storage access methods, things like input file stream and output file stream. These are the methods that you use for accessing files in Java. I'll show you a couple of examples in the show. So this exists, straightforward way of doing things. But if all that you're trying to do is store things like, for example, settings in your application. If you design an application, you always have settings in your application, right? Settings, as I'll show you with an example in short. So this kind of things, what we call as shared preferences, can easily be stored by using this method called shared preferences in Android. This is a very simple key value pairs. There's a key and there's a value for the key, and you use that to store information. This is a very lightweight storage, typically used for saving application settings and UI state. Next week, when you go to the lab, you will see the example where we make use of shared preferences for storing the user preferences in practice. User preferences and shared preferences are 2 separate things. You store user preferences using shared preferences, but shared preferences can be used for other purposes also. So don't equate the two. I'll make the distinction more as we go through this particular chapter. The third thing that we can make use of, if you want more fancy way of handling your data, is you can make use of a database. How many of you have taken database course before? One. Okay, about half of you. The rest of you have not taken a database course before? No? You don't know anything about databases? Okay, don't worry. I don't know anything about databases either. But I will teach you a little bit about SQLite, which is a simple database, fairly straightforward to use, and we'll see an example of usage of SQLite database in one particular application that you will see in the lab. Okay? You can use the code that I use for managing the SQLite database as a template for designing. If you don't know anything about databases, you can use that as a template for designing your own SQLite database. Anybody has experience with SQLite? SQL? Did you use SQL in the database course? Okay, so you know. SQLite is a lighter version of SQL. Lesser features than SQL. That's about it. And SQLite is a common approach that is used in most mobile devices. Even iOS also supports SQLite databases. Okay? So this is a lightweight database support that is available within your device. So if you need to store things and then and then access and retrieve things based upon keys and so on. This is a method of handling those kind of storage. Okay? 3 different methods that you can make use of in Android. Let's first start with this first method called as shared preferences. What exactly is shared preferences and how do we make use of it in practice? Now, you can also store your data on a server and then access the data from the server also by opening a stream to the server and then pulling in the data from the server and so on. As you have seen in the example where I used XML parsing, where I was storing XML data on the server and then pulling it in using XML parser, XML pull parser from the server and then accessing it and so on. So that is also feasible to do that. If you have large amounts of data to be stored, then your device will not have enough capacity to store it on a server and then query and retrieve it from the server. Okay? So you can support, for example, if you design an application, if you have large amounts of data to be searched and so on, you can support it by having a database on a server and then sending queries over the network to your database on the server and then retrieving data from the server and so on. We will see how to do that using HTTP and other protocols in one of the later chapters. So, let's first talk about shared preferences. This approach provides you with a very simple way of storing and retrieving persistent key value pairs of primitive data. You have a simple key and a corresponding value that you can store on a server. So typical usage for shared preferences is, for example, for saving application settings. Say you want to store the username and password within your application in order to access a server, for example, you can store such things in there. But remember that shared preferences are stored in text, plain text format on the device. Okay. But of course, if you are worried about security, your device is always with you. You have access to the device really. So it's not a big issue as far as I can see. So username and password, as I will show you with an example of how to make use of this in practice. The shared preferences information is stored on your device in XML format, typically in this directory. We will go into the directory structure and then actually look at the shared preferences file inside your emulator. If you connect a real mobile phone to the device to your PC, you can access the data on the mobile phone in Android if you use Eclipse as the approach for doing it. Okay, so that is feasible. Now, let's see. So shared preferences. This shared preferences can be associated with the entire application, meaning that shared preferences are accessible from any activity within an application, or you can attach shared preferences to a specific activity, meaning that the values stored in the shared preferences is only accessible from that particular activity of your application. So depending on your usage, you can store it in either approach. Now, how do you get hold of shared preferences that are stored on your device? For this, we use this method called get shared preferences to get access to the shared preferences. So you can do a statement like this within your code, and this way you get access to the shared preferences. And you give a name to shared preferences. For example, my preferences, settings, whatever you name it. And if the preferences file, XML file exists, then it is opened. If the file does not exist, then the file will be created for you on the device. If you need to control access permissions to the file, you can control access permissions by declaring it in here. Mode private means that this shared preferences file is accessible only to your application. If you say mode world readable, all applications that are residing on the device can access your shared preferences file, and more world writable, as you would expect, will allow any application to write into your shared preferences and so on. If you're using shared preferences for a specific activity, then you would access it. Instead of calling it by saying get shared preferences, you would say get preferences. In that case, the shared preferences for that specific activity will be opened. If you use this, you don't need to specify the name of the preferences file. There is always one associated with your activity variable. To add shared preferences, you have to first get hold of an editor object by calling this particular method. So preferences. This is the reference to the shared preferences here. And if you want to add more preferences to this shared preferences XML, then you need to change it into edit mode. Call that. After that, you can add things to the preferences by doing this. So, for example, you can create new preferences and add them into your file by using all these things. Put string, meaning that this is the name and this is the corresponding value. If you say put string, this value can be a string. If let's say put int, then it will be an integer value and so on. And after you have made changes, you have to commit the changes. When you do the commit, the changes will be written into the XML file that is storing your shared preferences for your application. If you need to retrieve the shared preferences, then you can say get string and then specify the name of the shared preference that you want. So, for example, if you store a username, then you say this, and then it will supply back the value that you have stored in your shared preference. So, this is a very easy way of accessing simple things that you can store on your device and get access to within your device.
Professor,
Yeah.
does it overwrite if there's already a username and password?
You mean this one?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it'll update. Okay? And you can get hold of it by using this. Okay? Now, shared preferences can be used by itself. You don't have to necessarily use it for any specific purposes, but if you want to store something and then retrieve it later within your application, you can make use of it very effectively by itself. But together with shared preferences, very often shared preferences are used for storing user preferences within your application. So they go hand in hand, because most of the time when you have user preferences, or what we call as settings in your application, when the user selects some settings, those values need to be saved, so that next time the user starts your application, those values will be accessible to the user at the point. So what I will do now is show you an example first today, then we'll come back on Friday and discuss how we implemented this example in more detail. Again, for this particular example, I will make use of our tried and tested example that we have seen earlier, the course info example. I'll show you how I make use of shared preferences within this example to do some interesting things. So this example, when you start the application, as you will notice, this application should start up in a few minutes, and you will see your standard things coming up on the screen. And then moving on to, you would notice that it has been changed a little bit. Now, I am using the same application, but to access two different course websites to retrieve information. So, how do I do that in practice? The way I do that is, as you can see, in this particular case, this example is accessing the website of this particular course on 4611. You know COM 4611, right? So I can go and access, and then you will see that the COM 4611's website is being accessed, unlike COM 4521, which you saw this example used earlier. And if I want to change, I can use the menu button, and then when I click on the menu button, I get this settings, and then I can click on settings, and then I have several preferences that I can do. You saw the splash screen usage, the animation thing usage. If I don't want to see it over and over again, I can click that, and then I will no longer see it when I start my animation. You can select the course that you want to use. So right now it is set to 4611. I can change the course to 4521, and then I can store user information. I can type in the user ID and password. And then I can type in, I don't have a student ID, so I will type in okay, and then I can go back, and you will see this is preferences activity, and this is how you set up preferences within your application if you want to allow users to make some choices. And then when you go back to the application, you will notice that the application is now accessing the other course website. And so obviously, 452 website is now displayed. Okay? How do I manage this? Similarly, 4521 website's information is displayed on the screen. And I can simply go back to my application and then change the settings. And then we have changed to the other course. So you can use the same application to support different courses. That was one of my motivations for making this change. I wanted to show that I can use a simple application that can support multiple courses. Obviously, in your semester, you're taking more than one course, right? How do you take this application and adapt it to be able to access different courses? Okay, so this is how I can do it in practice. And furthermore, as you saw, I turned off the splash screen. So what will happen is that this time, when I start the application, I will no longer see the splash screen. Instead, it will directly jump to application. Obviously, every time you don't want to be annoyed by the splash screen, you can turn it off. Okay? So that's one thing that you can achieve in practice. Now, so simple things that can be easily implemented within the application. So the next obvious question is, how do I go about doing this in practice? Okay, so to implement this, I have made use of shared preferences, and then I create a preference activity and then make use of it. So the way I do it is that I use this particular class called mysettings.java, inside which I created a new class called mysettings, and I use this to access all my settings. So in here, this is what is called as a singleton class. If you have studied Java, you know what a singleton class is. A singleton class is, there is only one instance of the class, and it is automatically that one instance is created when you declare the class. It's a very unique way of declaring things in Java. You don't want multiple instances of the objects to be created. You want only one instance. And then in the code, I will explain how the singleton class is implemented. This is nothing to do with this course, but I found that this was a way of implementing something in Java. So that's why I made use of it in this particular case. So this is an implementation of singleton class. And then how do I get hold of my preferences? So this is how I can get hold of it. This is one more method of accessing shared preferences. Preference manager, get default shared preferences for the context, and then inside there I have all the preferences stored here. Okay, this is splash screen preference, whether I want the splash screen to be shown or not. This is the course preference, which particular course I want to display, and then the user ID and student ID which have seen being used. And these are methods that I use to get and set the values of all these preferences. So I basically put all the changes that I want to make to my shared preferences in one single class so that it's easy to handle. From the remaining parts of the code, I can only access the shared preferences by calling this class and then making use of those. How do I make use of the singleton class inside my Java code? I will talk about that in more detail on Friday after I explain to you user preferences activity and so on in more detail. Okay? So you see some methods implemented for this particular singleton class here. Again, next week in the lab, you will get to see this particular example in more detail. So that's where you will learn more about how to make use of these things. This may be one way that you may want to implement preferences within your application, but this is not the only way. I don't profess that I know the best way of doing it. This is my way of doing it. You might have better ways of doing it within your own application, but this is a suggested way. If you like this, you can make use of this code within your own application very easily by modifying it. Okay? All right, so let me stop on this point today, and then we will continue on Friday.